good. Okay. Hit go live. Should be starting right now. Hey guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, and joined by my usual co-host, Matt Karoly. Of course, we're going to be talking quite a bit about the Falcons' recent matchup against the Denver Broncos in the Hall of Fame game, as well as their upcoming matchup uh, Thursday night with the Miami Dolphins in their second preseason game. But as usual, we like to start this show talking about any roster moves that the Falcons have made since we last did a show. And the Falcons have made a bevy of them. This past Friday, they signed a couple of defensive backs and cornerback Hamp Cheevers, formerly of Boston College, safety Ronald Martin. Great room for those guys. They wound up cutting Rashard Akazi and long snapper Kyle Vasey. The team also brought back quarterback Matt Sims to replace Kurt Benkert, who they put on IR, and they brought in an offensive lineman in Tommy Doles from Northwestern to sort of fill that roster spot. Matt, I'm curious, starting with the sort of the defensive backs and the moves there, what were your thoughts on those moves?
Yeah, the Cheevers one is probably the move of the bunch here that's most intriguing to me. You know, he's a guy that had a lot of fans in the draft community this past draft season, a guy that was super productive in Boston College. I believe led the nation in interceptions, if I'm not mistaken. So again, a guy that was productive, went undrafted, most likely due to size concerns, and with that, the lack of flexibility, he's probably only going to be a slot corner at the next level. Maybe he can prove us wrong on that. But I think, with bringing him in there and the fact that he might just be a slot corner, I think I'm kind of intrigued just from the standpoint that, this past Thursday, the top three corners that we saw get the most action were Jordan Miller, Ryan Neal opposite of him, and then Kendall Sheffield was primarily the slot guy. And I'm not sure how long, Ryan Suarez, he hasn't had a great camp. There's been tons of clips of him kind of getting beat in coverage, and then he was the culprit of that, game-losing touchdown at the end there. So, my thinking might be that, they kind of push him out, and Hamp Cheevers could have an opportunity to slide in there, and then, Kendall Sheffield can get some work on the outside, because I know they're trying to cross-train both Miller and Sheffield, and, with Sheffield getting the bulk of the work in the slot, he didn't see much, on the boundary. Cheevers in there, you have that opportunity to bump him outside, get him some work out there, being Sheffield, and Cheevers has a shot to, who knows, maybe push for, the sixth cornerback spot. I mean, I think Blitty Ray Wilson's a safe bet just because he's a veteran. You know what you can get from him, but he's still on a 1-year vet min deal. So if a guy like Cheevers shows the type of production, shows the type of play that he did at Boston College, maybe they'll be more inclined to hold on to someone like that. But at the very least, I think he's a good practice stash play for 2020. So yeah, I'm very intrigued by him. The other guys, I mean, Ronald Martin. There's something about him. I was looking a little bit up of him, this afternoon, and his picture, caught my attention. It's almost like I remember him from somewhere, but I'm not quite sure where. He was a second team All SEC at LSU his senior season, from what I found. Went undrafted to the Seahawks, which again is not surprising that the Falcons again are going. I don't look at him as any more than per se right now. Just to fill it the empty roster spot. Because again, I think safety, for the most part, if it's not going to be Kamal Ishmael, and it doesn't look like it's going to be Sherrod Neesman because they're bumping him to free safety, I think they would look for an actual veteran with some NFL experience, NFL starts, or at least games played under his belt, which Martin don't believe has. Maybe he has a couple. So yeah, again, I don't look at him as any more than a camp body. Kind of similar with Matt Sims. we know what to expect from him. He is what he is. We've seen him in here before. I think he's just, again, a guy to fill snaps to get us through the preseason. And I don't think he's really much of a threat to now Matt Schaub, who likely solidified the QB2 spot with Ben Kirk being placed on IR.
Yeah, we saw a little bit of Matt Sims a couple of summers ago where he did make a little bit of a legit push to be that QB3 that the Falcons had in the practice squad back in 2015, 2016. By this move, it's very clear that the Falcons are sort of rolling with what they have, and that's really the Ryan Schaub connection. I think you're right. Sims is not really a threat to push Matt Schaub like we thought Banker could have been prior to his injury. With the defensive backs, I know Ronald Martin was primarily a special teams guy for the Jets. I know Hamp Cheevers was a guy that a lot of people were high on this past year in the draft, and he wound up being undrafted. So I'll certainly be curious to sort of see, if Cheevers can make a late push because the Falcons right now, it's like we're looking at the cornerback position. Certain guys we know are locks. We know that the only real player that's like a not sort of a lock to make the team is somebody like a Bleedy Ray Wilson, and right now sort of Ryan Neal is that like seventh corner, and sort of the time that he spent on the roster last year playing safety, spent some time on the practice squad. He's a guy that you look at in terms of he's been around the building, and so that's a little bit of an uphill battle for Hamp Cheevers. But we've seen other guys, like I remember, it was somebody from Ohio State a couple of summers ago that was sort of signed in the middle of training camp, and then like it was the same summer that we had Desmond Southward, so I think it was maybe 2015 or whatever, and like within like 2 weeks he was like getting second team reps over Desmond Southward. So, it's one of those situations where it's not impossible for a guy to be a quote unquote camp body at this point in time and make a legitimate push for the roster or at least the practice squad. So I'll be curious to sort of see if Ham Cheevers lives up to some of that status. Yeah, I think Martin is really just kind of a depth guy. That we'll have to sort of see if the Falcons. We've talked about this on the last couple of episodes. We'll have to sort of see if the Falcons are sort of satisfied with Kamal Ishmael and Sherrod Neesman and Chris Cooper by the end, and Parker Baldwin by the end of the summer, or they're just sort of this is the first salvo in a couple of moves where they're going to wind up potentially readjusting their safety depth at the end of the summer.
Yeah, now we had a question about the cornerbacks, and I feel like maybe we should address it now since we're already on the topic. But from Justin Sandu at Justin201224 asked, which Falcons cornerbacks do you think will be active on game day early in the season? And, for me, I think the preseason still has a little bit to say in this matter because I think the team likely wants Jordan Miller and Kendall Sheffield, their two draft picks, to be, cornerbacks 4 and 5 that are active and playing special teams. And again, depending on if Miller beats out Sheffield or vice versa, they would be the next man up in case of an injury. So ideally, that's where, again, if they continue their play, I think Sheffield and Miller both showed some stuff in the first preseason game. So if they continue that, then maybe you see a scenario where Bleedy Ray Wilson would be the inactive cornerback as the sixth guy, and if that's the case, then that takes me back to what I was saying about Cheevers as far as if he does show some of the stuff that he showed draft pundits this past offseason, then holding on to a guy that you have some control over for the next 3 years, that's worth keeping around if he's going to be your sixth guy and your sixth guy was going to be inactive anyway. So again, that's kind of the thing I'm curious about with this Cheevers pickup because I do think there's some talent there that maybe the Falcons can get out of him. But as of right now, if the season were to start, I think Bleedy Ray Wilson would be active, and then it's a matter of who has shown more between Miller and Sheffield. So what do you think about that, Aaron? What's your take so far on the cornerbacks?
Yeah, no, I think Cheevers would have to really come on strong to make a real push for the roster. I think just because Bleedy Ray Wilson is experienced, and outside of Trufant, the Falcons have like no experience at the cornerback position. I feel pretty confident that unless something weird happens, that Bleedy Ray Wilson is a relatively safe. Again, I won't say he's a lock, but I think he's a relatively safe guy just to have somebody who's actually covered NFL wide receivers on the roster other than Desmond Trufant coming off the bench. So I think you're right. I think the plan for the Falcons is they want to see what Sheffield, they want to see what Miller are going to do, because we know, again, Trufant, Oliver, Casey, their roles are solidified. They're going to be the top three corners. It's really about who's that fourth guy, who's that fifth guy. And, Bleedy Ray Wilson is sort of their emergency option. If they don't like what they see from Sheffield or Miller this summer, then Bleedy Ray Wilson is a proven option that they can sort of plug in there. In terms of who's going to be active on game day, it's tough to know, because I agree with sort of what Matt says, because traditionally the Falcons have 8 defensive backs active on Sundays, and usually that's either a breakdown of 5 corners and 3 safeties, or 4 corners and 4 safeties. And because of Casey's ability to sort of be a dual threat, you could potentially have it be sort of him be the 5th corner / the 4th safety in that sort of combination. I think right now, we need to see what Jordan Miller does on special teams, because, going back to last week, it was Kendall Sheffield who was working with the quote unquote starting special teams on the punt team as a gunner. And we know that gunner spot opposite Russell Gage is open because of the departure of Justin Bethel. And I do think Kendall Sheffield probably is potentially the front runner, but again, it's going to have to play out. You're going to have a number of guys. The Falcons had like 6 guys work as gunners in that Broncos game, and none of Russell Gage did not necessarily get any work on special teams there. So it's these guys are all fighting for a spot. So I think whoever winds up being the gunner, whether it's Miller, whether it's Sheffield, and as well as sort of who performs well on defense, will sort of be the 4th guy, and then whether that other guy gets another opportunity to be active on game days will sort of depend on whether or not they're a valuable piece on special teams, whether or not they perform on defense. So I would sit here to answer Justin's question. I'm pretty confident that we'll see Trufant. We'll see at least 4 guys. And I think right now the 4th guy will probably, I'll lean towards Kendall Sheffield, but we'll have to sort of see in terms of what plays out over the summer. And then I think it's possible that Jordan Miller could be that 5th guy, depending on how he performs on special teams and how he performs on defense. I think he's off to a good start. So, we'll just have to keep an eye on whether or not he starts to, he was like the 3rd string gunner on punt team last week. So if he's the 2nd string guy this week, that's a positive sign. And then, by the end of the summer, if he's, working with the starting special teams group, then that will be definitely an indicator. So that's something to pay attention to.
Speaking of special teams too, I know we talked about Justin Hardy standing on the roster, and a lot of that I feel like does stem from his special teams play. I mean, is that something that we can read into as far as, I don't recall how much he played on special teams. I know he had a couple series on offense, but is that something we can read into as far as them, trying a guy like Sheffield there? And if he's the gunner opposite Russell Gage, does that make Hardy, in your opinion, any more expendable because he's not going to be in that role? And
Well, the issue is, I think Hardy hasn't really been a gunner on the punt team since like the midway through the 2017 season.
right.
Like they sort of put Marvin Hall there, and I think Bleedy Ray Wilson also sort of filled in there as well.
But wasn't that something coming into the season? Weren't you thinking that could be an option for him, and that's kind of why they might have brought him back as opposed to, Marvin Hall? Obviously they let go, but they brought Hardy back with maybe the intention that he can fill in there for a season. No?
I think that's really like, I don't know, like Plan C or something like that, because it's been clear that the Falcons.
Okay.
I think the Falcons know exactly what Justin Hardy is on special teams, because he was, kind of a standout there for 2 seasons. So I think the Falcons want to see what other guys can do, and have made moves specifically with the idea that these other guys can perform there. But I am going to be curious to sort of see if the Falcons do put Justin Hardy back on teams this year, just to have him do something on game day. Because again, my theory for why the Falcons had him return punts last year is because he didn't really have anything else to do, because there's, he's basically Sanu and Ridley's backup, but he's really like the 3rd string guy there, because Ridley basically fills in for Sanu when Sanu needs a breather, and then Hardy only fills in for those guys if both of them need a breather. So it's one of those things where like he doesn't really have a lot to do on game days because he's just not getting a ton of work on offense. So it makes sense for him to have a role on special teams. And again, going back to the first 2 years or 2.5 years in his career, he was really valuable there as a gunner on punt team. And then I think he got hurt. I think he had a shoulder injury that year. And then I think the Falcons have basically not had him do that. And so I don't think we'll see him as a gunner this year, but he could at least be on kickoff coverage, like that was something that he did really well. And so I'll be curious to sort of see what the Falcons' plan is. But yeah, I don't think Justin Hardy has anything to prove as far as his special teams ability, just because he has 2.5 years of a really solid body of work there.
Fair enough.
Let's talk about the big event that happened this weekend after the game. Was the Falcons' former tight end, the GOAT, as some would put it, Tony Gonzalez, going into Hall of Fame. Matt, you were there, so I'll just give you the floor to talk about what you saw on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great night. I said it on Locked On Falcons earlier this week. For any football fan that has the opportunity to make it to Canton, absolutely do so. It's a great of, when I went to the NFL draft in 2017 around Philly, just kind of the atmosphere. It's a very party-centric kind of environment. Games, music, just football fans getting together, having a good time. And then, obviously the museum, the rich history there. It's the birthplace of football, which I really wasn't certain of heading into it. Like, I didn't know why Canton was the spot, but that's where professional football originated. It's not where the NFL originated, but it's where professional football originated. So a lot of great history to see. So, I encourage anyone to make it there if they can. And then, obviously the ceremony, started at 7. Tony kind of finished it. It was like 11:45. So it's a long day, but, the speeches for the most part, like my one, I guess, nitpicking was that, some of the speeches can drag on. Like I was shocked that Tony's speech was actually the longest of the night. Went a little over 39 minutes. Some of the other speeches seemed much longer than that. But just hearing their stories, hearing where they came from, how they got to the point that they're at, and then, some of the guys, shouting out the writers that were instrumental in voting them in, I thought was really cool. And, it made me think of, Matt Ryan and some of the other guys for the Falcons that are going to be up for discussion or have been up for discussion for Hall of Fame induction. It made me think of who might those writers be that will champion for those guys. So just a very cool experience just to see all that stuff, them talking about that stuff, them on a personal level, which when you're watching them you don't always get to see. So yeah, I mean, Tony's speech was awesome. I thought his was one of the best. I mean, I know we're biased in saying that. Him and Kevin Mawai, I thought, were the two best speeches, just because I felt like they were really well structured. They hit on kind of the points you expect them to hit on. I was a little curious going in how Chiefs fans would receive him based on some of the comments that he had made, I guess, when word broke that he was going to be inducted. And that news, took place in Atlanta. So I think that had a lot to do with what Tony said as far as how, Atlanta made his career. And I think that kind of miffed Chiefs fans a little bit. But, what he had to say to them and his experiences there, I think definitely soothed over that relationship if there was any soothing necessary. So, again, cool to see, him talking about Matt Ryan and how he considers Matt Ryan to be one of the best quarterbacks out there and on his way to being one of the best of all time. That was just like the cherry on top as a Falcons fan, being there and listening to that. So, if the GOAT thinks that, then obviously I think there is some merit to that. So yeah, just a cool experience, once in a lifetime. Hopefully maybe I'll go one more time again when Matt is up for induction. But again, I encourage anyone that if you have an opportunity at some point in your lifetime, check it out because it's a cool place for football fans to be.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. There you have it, guys. So let's talk about the game and some of the players that stood out. And one of the things that we're going to do for the preseason, and maybe this will carry over into the regular season when we discuss some of these games, is we're going to do sort of a 3-up, 3-down. Matt and I will sort of pick 3 players that we want to highlight, particularly in the preseason, that we think raise their stock in terms of whether or not, depending on what, some of these guys are fighting for roster spots, some of these guys are fighting for depth chart spots, some of these guys are just, fighting expectations in terms of what people sort of see these guys as. And then, of course, we'll pick 3 guys that may have, not quite lived up in those regards. So, Matt, start with your 3 guys that you want to highlight that were up after this Broncos game.
Yeah, so I'll start with 2 obvious ones that did get a lot of attention, throughout Falcons Twitter and whatnot, and that was Brian Hill and John Kaminsky. We had talked, I think, last week about Brian Hill and how I think both of us are kind of pounding the table and hoping that the Falcons, hold on to him, if not for anything more than a stash play in the event of an injury or down the road as far as a guy that could potentially, be a bell cow or at least be in a committee type backfield. And, I think Brian Hill, more than anyone, helped his stock. Just love the way he runs. Every single time he gets the ball, he's running with aggression, running with purpose, running violently, which is, one of the things I think Thomas Mitchell and Dan Quinn used to describe his running style when they drafted him back in 2017 was that he runs very violently. And we saw that again last Thursday with the play where he lowered his shoulder and, incorrectly was called for an unnecessary roughness. But I think that was just, an encapsulation of Brian Hill to a T. Finished with 11 carries, 57 yards, a receiving touchdown, which, again, it was a kind of a blown coverage by the Broncos. But the fact that he is a factor in the pass game now and something Dan Quinn talked about, kind of, rounding out his game a little bit more, since that's not something he necessarily showed too much in his college days at Wyoming. So, again, if he can show he could be a 3-down back and continues to, have performances like this, I think it's going to be very tough to keep him off the 53-man roster. So, again, he helped his case out. And if he continues this, again, I think he has a spot on the 53-man roster. The other guy, John Kaminsky, again, someone that he's been my biggest surprise thus far from what we've seen and heard around Flowery Branch. A guy that I didn't think was going to have a major role in 2019. But if he plays like he did on Thursday throughout this preseason and can carry it forward, into the regular season, I think he will have a role. And I think special teams is where, is where he has the edge. I mean, he's the one that had the fumble recovery on special teams, showing his motor, showing the effort that has been said time and time again about him. So finished with 5 tackles, 1 sack, 1 tackle for loss. Again, a guy that if he keeps this up, I mean, he's going to be a rotational guy backing up Alan Bailey in that, strong side defensive end role. It's good to see. I mean, it shows that the Falcons potentially could have, a 2-deep rotation. And that brings me to my 3rd guy, one that's not so obvious. Pro Football Focus did think that he had a great game, and that's Justin Zimmer. I think there's, one defensive line spot up for grabs at the moment. And I think Justin Zimmer, showed that he's continuing to get better. We saw him, which was a little bit interesting for me. We saw him at the nose tackle as opposed to 3-tech. You would think with his athleticism, the 3-techs, and I believe it was Drew Lock. So a guy that in Pro Football Focus's eyes fared well and on the rewatch did some good things on the defensive line. So he was a guy that I think, again, if he can continue this type of performance, kind of like he did last preseason, I think he could be a guy, at least for the first couple weeks, because, again, we've said this, many times, the Rashid Hageman, they don't have to make a decision on him until week 3 due to the suspension. So Justin Zimmer is a guy in my, one and only roster projection I had pegged as that placeholder for the time being. And I think Thursday he kind of showed why that can become a reality come September.
Okay. My 3 up that I want to highlight are not necessarily like the first guy in Wes Schweitzer is not necessarily a guy I thought came in and had a great game against Denver, but I did see some progress, I thought, with his time at center, that he spent a lot of time at the center position. And based off of where he left off last summer, where he sort of played in that preseason finale, got some, a couple of series as a center, and I was pretty unimpressed with his performance there. I thought I saw some positive gains there. And so I like to see that. I like to see if, I think he's off to a good start as far as the summer goes relative to sort of what the expectations. Again, I am one of those people that thinks Wes Schweitzer gets a little bit of a bad rap from certain corners of the fan base. They act like he's like the worst offensive lineman in the history of the world. It's certainly true that when he messes up at times over the years as a guard, he looks pretty bad. But I think he doesn't get enough credit for those games where he's not really that noticeable and actually plays reasonably well. So I think he's off to a positive start as far as his quote unquote transition to a center position. The other person I highlight, even though he only really played 3 snaps in this game, I thought those first 2 snaps before he got hurt that you mentioned in Rashid Hageman, I thought he looked pretty good. And one of the questions I had coming into this summer in this training camp was, would we see sort of Rashid Hageman hit the ground running and play like the player that he looked like at the end of the 2016 season rather than the guy that we had seen for the bulk of the 2.5 years prior to that. And I thought, again, based off of a very limited sample size with 2 plays before he suffered that groin injury, I thought he looked like that guy. He looked like a guy that was a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more decisive with his hands, and trying to use that. When in previous times when Hageman was here, he was just raw strength and raw power rather than any sort of technique or setup or whatever. So I like to see that. We'll have to sort of see sort of when he comes back from this groin injury. Like you said, the 2-game suspension that he's serving at the start of the season does give him a little bit more time to get healthier than your average player who we would need that guy back, at a certain point in order to increase his chances. But, I think we'll have to sort of see sort of how much time he's going to miss. Expectation is he'll miss tomorrow night's game against Miami, but hopefully he can come back for the game against I think the Jets or the next game after that. So if he can get back for that one, that will be a positive thing. And hopefully if he can, be healthy and play like he did for those first 2 snaps for 20 to 30 snaps, and I think that's a positive sign for him. And the last person I'll highlight is Chris Lindstrom. I thought did some really positive work at the right guard position for a couple of series to start the game, and I think is living up to some of the hype that we got with him basically coming in and not really having to compete for that starting right guard spot. And so I thought we saw some positive things from him in that first game. He wasn't perfect by any means, but I certainly think played pretty well for his NFL debut, and I'm eager to see what he can do now over these next couple of games where he's actually going to see some reps against some legit, starters. Besides Adam Gotsis, I don't know how many times he went one-on-one with Gotsis last week, but we're going to see him get some opportunity against some quote-unquote real NFL defensive linemen. So I'm eager to see what he could do. He got down.
Yes. Yeah, as far as my 3 downs, so Sean Harlow, I thought maybe we'd see a little bit of a left guard competition based on the fact that Carpenter and Brown were dressed, but that ended up not being the case. And Sean Harlow was the first guy up at left guard, and it did not go well for him. I think you had noted that all 3 pass plays on that first series, Harlow gave up pressures, and then he also had a holding call. So it did not go well for Sean Harlow,
I
who's
don't
a
want to.
guy
I don't
that
want to cut you off, Matt. But like that's what I'm talking about with Adam Gotsis. Like Gotsis is a starter, and
is an
Gotsis
NFL level player.
he
Sure.
he he tore him a new one in that first series, and it was very
Right.
clear that Gotsis. This is why Gotsis is a starter, and this is why Sean Harlow is a third string offensive lineman. But continue.
Yeah, so it shouldn't be on an NFL roster, I think, based on what we saw uh, from him on Thursday. And again, I was about to say a guy that desperately needs to show something because he's on his last leg. Sean Harlow already was cut once by the Falcons, and it's looking like he's headed for a second cut if we see more of the same from him going forward. The other guys, 2 draft picks, Quadri Olson, Marcus Green, I was excited to see both of those guys. But Quadri Olson, it wasn't a great debut for him. It wasn't terrible. You could say the blocking had some role to play, but I'd also caution people on that because Brian Hill did have similar level the same blockers in front of him. And out of the backfield in the pass game, Quadri did have 1 drop in the red zone. So again, for a guy that's fighting, not fighting, I guess battling with Brian Hill for that third running back spot. I would say clearly Brian Hill, showed the better performance, has the leg up at this point heading into preseason game number 2. And also there was one particular play where, from a pass blocking standpoint, Allison, kind of got steamrolled by Shamarko Thomas on a safety blitz, and which led to, I believe, a Benkirk or Schaub snap. I forget who was in at the time. But again, pass protecting is huge for young running backs coming in. That's a ticket to the bench or playing time if you can show that you can do it. And Quadri didn't really show that in the first game. So, I was a little disappointed in his debut. Again, he's a draft pick. His roster spot's not in jeopardy. He's going to be on the team, but it's a matter of, does he have a role early on, or if Hill continues to show the types of performances he has and continues to show out on special teams, which, he has, been talked up a little bit on that, shown improvement on that, and he did play pretty decently in special teams on Thursday. Then you kind of have to give the edge right now to Hill in that regard. And then as far as Marcus Green's concerned, he's the front runner to win this punt return, kick return job. But, if he keeps whiffing or muffing punts like he does, well, then, I think Kenyon Barner, that's the reason Kenyon Barner is in here as that insurance policy, because you know what you can expect from him. So disappointing first game from Marcus Green as far as the punt and kick return battle is concerned. And then also, on offense, I was intrigued heading into this season and still am as far as what his role is going to be there. But it does look like his 2019 contribution is going to come, kind of solely from special teams, until further notice. It doesn't look like he's going to have a huge role on offense, which is a little disappointing. But I don't know if it's necessarily him or just, the philosophy of the coaching staff. But again, kind of was excited to see Green, and he didn't kind of live up to my expectations in game 1. Whether they were too high or to begin with, I mean, that's up for discussion. But as far as the punt return, kick return battle goes, I mean, that's a underrated battle. And, obviously they want Green to be that guy, because if he's not, then it does have, a ripple effect as far as, having to keep an extra running back in Kenyon Barner on the roster. And that'll, affect depth elsewhere. So, again, hopefully Green can bounce back and has a better performance in game 2.
Yeah, the players I want to highlight that I was a little disappointed by, and I'm not going to talk about Matt Schaub. He's the obvious one. I think we all know there.
Yeah. Yeah.
For me, Ricky Ortiz, and he was a player that I liked last summer. In my ever consuming quest to find a good replacement for Patrick DeMarco, I thought Ricky Ortiz did some positive things during the course of the season. He had ups and downs, but I thought it was a solid first year when you compare it to sort of what DeMarco was in his first year in Atlanta, where he wasn't necessarily spectacular. I thought, they were comparable. But against Denver, and the big question was, would the Falcons keep a fullback? They used a healthy amount of fullback usage, so Ortiz got a lot of work. But one wonders if a guy like a Luke Stalker is going to wind up taking that job. And based off of how Ortiz performed against Denver, I didn't think he necessarily put the best foot forward. And, the fact that the Falcons didn't bring a second fullback to compete with him indicates, it at least implies, that the Falcons aren't going to necessarily carry a fullback unless it's Ricky Ortiz. And he did not get off to the best start. And so, he's one of the players I had down. The other player I had down was, Kamal Ishmael. If you listened to last week's show, I had serious questions about Ishmael's ability in coverage. I thought, if you grade him on a curve when he was trying to cover Noah Fant one-on-one, considering what Kamal Ishmael has done in previous stints, maybe you could say that he did a decent job. But it does make me question, sort of if that's going to be if he's our primary backup to Keanu Neal at that strong safety position. And yeah, I know we have Devondre Campbell who can cover tight ends, but if for whatever reason Kamal Ishmael has to come into the game, can the Falcons play their normal defense where they would ask a Keanu Neal to play strong safety, or would they basically, then if they have to have Campbell cover the tight ends, then what really is Kamal Ishmael really adding at that point to the defense if he's not going to be a factor in coverage. So it wasn't a great first outing. I know Noah Fant is a great athlete and all these various things, and one of those players that people think in a couple of years is going to be one of the top tight ends in the league. So it's not as if he had the easiest player to cover. But like those are the types of tight ends that you're going to have to cover if you're going to be an effective, fill-in starter for this Falcon team at that strong safety position. And I didn't think it was a great debut for Kamal Ishmael, but hopefully he'll improve in the coming weeks. And the last person I'm going to say was down for me, not because I'm not particularly mad at him, but he's got he's got big shoes to fill, and he did not get off to the best start, and that's Giorgio Tavecchio. 54-yard field goal, that's basically a coin toss as far as the NFL goes in terms of making it. And I don't know about the playing surface at Canton or whatever at Tom Benson Stadium. Maybe Tom Benson was reaching out from the grave to spite the Falcons a little bit. I don't know, but basically you don't get off to the best start with this fan base when we've had such a high bar for kicking consistency by missing your first field goal, sort of as the guy. So not a big deal in the long stretch of things, but certainly this fan base is not going to be very forgiving for a kicker, even if he misses like 3 kicks this year. That's like seemingly, not really, but it's 3 more than we're used to seeing a guy miss. So he's got big shoes to fill in, and not a great start for him, but it's not as if it's the end of the world with Giorgio.
I'm curious, just to go back to Ishmael, outside of obviously his role on special teams, what's your ideal fit for him in this defense? Like,
I like him as a linebacker.
I'm saying which linebacker position? Is Sam linebacker, keep him as close to the line of scrimmage, defending the run and defending that action as possible?
I mean, I thought he did well in 2017 when he was playing both Will and Sam. I thought he did that job perfectly. And then they pulled him off the field in the nickel situations. I thought that was the ideal role for him. And I thought that was like some of the best performance I've seen of Kamal Ishmael in his entire career. So like that to me is sort of what he is. He's like a versatile backup that can, that has played middle linebacker, that's played Sam, that's played Will. He's started at multiple of those spots, and he's a versatile, valuable backup that can play all 3 spots, similar to Bruce Carter. That's his value to this team. And, him as a strong safety, I don't like it.
But it's because of the man coverage responsibilities, right?
Well, I mean, like the issue with Ishmael always, even before the Falcons became a man-heavy scheme, even in the Mike Nolan years when they were playing him at safety, like he just is not a very fast guy. And so when the further you get him away from the line of scrimmage, the more he has to cover, more ground he has to cover, even if you're playing zone. And it's just not really what he does well. And so, like, that's one of the reasons why over time he's slowly closer to the line of scrimmage, because that just means you don't have to cover as much ground if you're closer to the line of scrimmage. So,
yeah.
like, I just feel like you're making his biggest weakness into a bigger weakness by playing him at safety.
Yeah. All right.
All right, let's talk about the Dolphins game, which is happening tomorrow or Thursday if you guys are not listening to this on Wednesday when we're live. Matt, what are some of the things that you're going to have your eye on?
I mean, I'm not expecting a whole lot different as far as who we're going to see. I think, we should treat this game as the first preseason game. So, I'm expecting to see the starters for maybe a couple plays, maybe not even an entire series. I think we're going to see more of the same guys that, again, are fighting for some of the last roster spots, on the 53-man roster. So, again, we're going to monitor guys like Kaminsky and Hill and the guys we talked about earlier, just to see, if their stock continues to soar, if it goes back down, what happens there. For me, really, I got my eyes on some of the general aspects of what we saw from the offense and defense in the first game, as far as, we did see quite a bit of play action from the offense, which was a positive. I didn't chart it or anything, but from the eye test, 40 to 50% of the plays appeared to be play action, which, again, the more play action for this offense, the better. I think, a guy like Matt Ryan running the play action is at his best. The league in general, the numbers say offenses are at their best in the play action. So again, is that something we can expect? Hopefully. Um, I didn't like some of the screen concepts that we saw from the offense in on Thursday. Again, I'm not sure how much Dirk Cutter's tipping his hand, and I don't know if we're going to see any more or any less uh, in this second game, just because, again, we should treat it like the first one, and I think you're going to see guys like Matt Sims play, 3 quarters, perhaps. So they're probably going to keep it vanilla for him since he's just coming back from a couple year hiatus from the team. As for the defense goes, it does appear that this 5-2 or 3-4, whatever you want to call it, defense is here to stay. I know before we came on the show, I saw you had a tweet as far as you charting the actual percentages, and I was a little surprised that the 5-2 base wasn't used as significantly. And I do want to get your thoughts on that because I noticed, when watching on the rewatch, at times they would show a 4-3 under, it looked like. And then, whether you want to call him that Sam linebacker or that 3-4 edge outside linebacker, he would then drop down and kind of the defense would shift back into that 5-2. So I'm curious how you kind of charted those plays and what you considered what. In your charting. But yeah, I'm going to continue to monitor that because I think that's one of the interesting storylines for this defense as far as Dan Quinn trying different things. Another thing I noticed was that big nickel, and that's something that some of the beat writers have talked about with the 3 safety big nickel look. They had Parker Baldwin, Kamal Ishmael, and Niesman at times, and then Cooper was even back there in that look. So again, Dan Quinn's trying different things. I don't know if this is just an experimentation phase or this is something we should expect, but the more we see it, the more I'm inclined to think it's not necessarily experimentation and more what we should expect from the Falcons is being more multiple and not being just here we're going to run our cover 3, 4-3 under, and we're going to rely on our players, but we're going to actually show some flexibility and show some different looks to confuse offenses. So those are some of the things I'm looking for as we go on and, as we enter this game 2 in Miami tomorrow night.
Yeah. With the 4-3-5-2, 3/3-4, whatever you want to call it. The thing I noticed that stood out to me with their usage was it was sort of based off of personnel more so than scheming. And like with the 5-2, it was primarily whenever you saw York Bethune or Austin Larkin on the field, they were primarily playing that 3-4-5-2 look. And then when you saw sort of Durant Miles and Trey Crawford out there, it was primarily they were going back to more of a traditional 4-3. Really, with the 3 down linemen, between the 3-4 and the 4-3, wasn't that different. You just have guys sort of slide over. So it's really like not that much of a difference between the schematically. It's just like, okay, is that guy standing up? Does that guy slide over? Does that guy move over a little bit there and change their techniques a little bit there? But, it seemed like to me there was more personnel driven than necessarily the Falcons were doing it for, specific situations. So it was like, oh, okay, here's a series for Austin Larkin and York Bethune. We're going to play more 5-2 looks. Okay, here's a series for, Durant Miles and Trey Crawford. We're going to get more 4-3 looks. And they kind of went back and forth with that throughout the game, I think. So that was more my main takeaway as far as that goes. I don't know if that answered your question, Matt.
Yeah. I mean, I just considered when I saw Durant Miles and Trey Crawford, I looked at them the same way as I looked at Bethune and Larkin, but I don't necessarily disagree if that's not how you viewed it or how
Yeah, I
others
mean,
might view it.
it
Because
was tough to sort of be like, okay, is this a 4-3 or is 5-2? Is like, or
again, it goes back to the whole thing that we've said. I mean, the 4-3 under defense kind of functions, as
yeah,
a inverse 3-4, as it has 3-4
yeah, it's like
principles.
a one
So
gapping
it
3-4.
is
Yeah,
tough. It becomes gray. It becomes gray.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah. So I mean, like, I think the Falcons. Yeah, we've talked about it before, in terms of
right.
sort of their usage of it, and I'll be curious if we see that to start this game with Tack and Vic if the starters are going to be playing like you say. I expect them to play a series. I think the only real question is, do they play more than one series? Is if the first series is a 3-and-out, and the Falcons are like, hey, let's give them a couple more snaps on the second series or whatever. But yeah, I
Yeah,
expect that we will probably see the starters get pulled after the first series. And so one of the players that I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do, because I think the Dolphins secondary is one of the strengths of their is the actual strength of their roster. I want to see what Russell Gage does against starting caliber NFL corners. I know Russell Gage has been getting a lot of hype. I've been a little skeptical of the Russell Gage hype. I can't be that impressed when he's beating Ryan Neal, a player who you at the top of the show said like you don't know if he's going to make it to the end of
yeah,
camp. So I want to see what he can do
yeah.
against real NFL corners, and whether or not this whole this connection that he and Matt Ryan or allegedly have built this summer over the last couple of months, because basically he's been getting all of Julio's starting reps. Does that apply in a game, or is that just a practice thing that he's getting a lot of these targets against presumably lesser corners like the Falcons have on their bench and whatnot. So that's one of the things I'm eager to see. I want to see if this front can get after Josh Rosen and Ryan Fitzpatrick, just because we know the Dolphins, the biggest weakness on their offense, or really on their team, is probably their offensive line. I want to see what these young cornerbacks can do against some of these fast wide receivers that Miami has. I want to see, Kamal Ishmael, just talked about him. The Dolphins have a bunch of tight ends. I don't know how many of them are good, but, they have guys like Mike Gesicki and Dwayne Allen and Nick O'Leary and whatnot. And this, again, none of these guys are top tier NFL tight ends at this point in time, but they're all guys that can play in this league. And so, if Kamal Ishmael can sort of rebound after a relatively rough outing against Noah Fant, can he do it against these other guys? And so, okay, does that set a benchmark? Okay, like he can cover Mike Gesicki, he can't cover Noah Fant. So, does that mean obviously I don't think he can cover like Zach Ertz or anything like that, but maybe he can cover, I don't know, some mid-tier starting tight end or whatever the case may be. So those are some of the matchups I'm looking forward to. And yeah, I'm just eager to see some of these guys that basically got sat last week, that aren't necessarily starters, that aren't necessarily proven guys, that are just like Isaiah Oliver, Devontae Casey. I don't know how much work they're going to get on Thursday, but I want to see what they look like, because we haven't really seen them so far this summer. So it's a lot of guys like that I'm eager to see.
Yeah, I mean, it will be interesting because I think, the fact that the Dolphins have Rosen now and have Fitzpatrick, I mean, they have, you could say, two starting caliber quarterbacks. Broncos necessarily couldn't say that, with Kevin Hogan playing and Drew Lock still kind of a ways to go. They're not necessarily starting caliber right now. So the fact that the Falcons' second string defense, third string defense are going to see a starting caliber quarterback, um, that's something to monitor as far as how they do against that level of
Yeah.
competition.
So we got some mailbag questions we want to get to. And our first one comes from Brian at your homeboy Brian on Twitter. He asks, do you think Brian Hill will ever be a number one or number two running back for the Falcons in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think he can certainly be, kind of where Tevin Coleman was as far as, in a running back by committee. I think a lot has to do with Devontae Freeman's future. Uh, if he has the bounce back season that I expect, then I think Devontae Freeman has a couple more years in Atlanta. So with that being said, I think that limits Brian Hill's ceiling here, to being no more than what kind of Tevin Coleman was for Devontae Freeman earlier in his career. But I love Hill's skill set, and again, if he continues to add something as a pass catcher and really rounds out his game, then yeah, I absolutely think he can be a guy that can be a featured back in this league. So again, if he continues to show these level of performances, I mean, when Brian Hill has been in action, he kind of hasn't disappointed me too much. I mean, sure, he's had some boneheaded plays, in Carolina game at the end there with some of the, unnecessary taunting and whatnot. But, if he keeps his head on straight and by all accounts, it looks like he's slimmed down and really got into even better football shape. Yeah, I absolutely think he can be a guy that can be, in a 1-2 punch scenario for the Falcons in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, no, I think the point that you made about him slimming down, I think is a good one. Um, People have been obsessed for some reason in my eyes with the Falcons having a power back, and that's one of the reasons why they drafted Quadri Olison. And one of the things I thought about Olison when after we drafted him is like he needs to lose like 10 or 15 pounds, and he'll be a better running back
Hmm.
for it, so he can be a little bit more quick. And that was the same thing. We went through this with Brian Hill a couple of years ago when we drafted him. Oh, the Falcons finally got a big physical running back, and it's like no, just be quick and explosive. That's where the league is going. The days of the LeGarrette Blount's and the TJ Duckett's is kind of a dying day because the game is so geared around the passing game and it's about being quick and all these various things. But in terms of what Brian Hill could be, like when we drafted him, I was like, my thought process was like, I can envision a future in like 3 years at that point, where Brian Hill is sort of the lead guy in a committee system for the Falcons and giving us 800 to 1,000 yards rushing as sort of the lead guy in a committee running back. So the idea, that he could be that, yeah, I think that's possible. My big question is whether or not the Falcons have really sort of put too many roadblocks in his way to prevent that from happening. This is what Matt and I have been discussing in some of these recent shows. It's like, I've always been a fan of Brian Hill, and, he's getting a lot of buzz, and I like hearing that. But I also sort of feel like the Falcons, this is one of the things that the Falcons kind of do from a time to time where they'll sort of clear the runway for certain players, like a Marcus Green, in my opinion, where the Falcons got rid of Marvin Hall, largely in my opinion, because there was really no likelihood that Marcus Green could beat Marvin Hall out in a competition or any new return specialist that the Falcons would have brought in this offseason. And meanwhile, they have a guy like Brian Hill and they go out there and draft a Quadri Olison. They go out there and sign a Kenyon Barner and seem to put obstacle at an obstacle in his way to prevent him from making the team. So, like, that's my big question is like when push comes to shove, are the Falcons going to be like, yes, we like Brian Hill's ability and we're willing to hang on to that, even though we know, having a third or fourth running back at this position seems like a little bit of a luxury given, injuries that are going to crop up over the course of the season at other positions, and you're going to need to go out there and get a body. Or are you going to be willing to stash Brian Hill as that third or fourth running back for the entirety of the season, be committed to him? And the reason why I raise that question is because that's basically the situation the Falcons had when Hill was a rookie, and they weren't committed to that, and they wound up letting him go. So, once we've already seen them not do it, so I'm curious if they will do it. So that's why I'm a little skeptical, a little bit of some of the Hill buzz and the little Hill hype. Not because I don't think he's worthy of it. It's just I want to see this team actually go out there and make a commitment to a guy who I think is a pretty talented running back. So our next question comes from a fan since 1988. He asks about an explanation of the Ryan restructure that they should do next year. Could you guys do a deep dive on this and how it differs from the traditional restructure?
I think is he potentially referring
Yeah,
to
that conversation we had the other day about
the
the
yeah
voidable
the
years.
voided
Yeah.
the voidable years restructure? I guess the easiest way for me to explain it is, and this is something we've seen the Saints, the Eagles, and most recently the Patriots now do with Tom Brady. Is the way it works is, you know, a signing bonus can get prorated over at most 5 years. So, say a guy gets $20 million signing bonus, $4 million of that can hit each of the next 5 years. If you give a guy a 2 year contract, though, usually how it works is that signing bonus can only get prorated over the length of the contract, 2 years. But in the case of Tom Brady's deal, he got a 2 year deal, but they added voidable years. So that allows them to extend the signing bonus proration past the 2 years of the contract. Now, the contract is still only 2 years, but the signing bonus, so basically the team has a cap hit for Tom Brady in the years following his contract term. So that was something that I was suggesting on Twitter, that once Ryan is at that similar age level that Drew Brees and Tom Brady are in the late 30s, even early 40s if he's playing till then, that to extend their window and to lower the cap hits, they might add voidable years after Ryan's time is done in Atlanta to kind of save some cap hits. And again, that's something that the Eagles did with Brandon Graham recently this offseason. He got a 3-year deal, but they added 2 voidable years to his contract so that they can prorate the signing bonus over the maximum 5 years. So again, it's not something that I necessarily see the Falcons doing in the short term, because again, you have to have the right level of type of contract to do it, and most of the contracts that the Falcons are giving are the full 4 or 5 year term, so voidable years don't really come into play there. Now, I think where the miscommunication was, I'm in no way saying that the Falcons shouldn't do the traditional restructure, which is what we saw this offseason. Basically just taking a player's base salary, shrinking it to like the vet min, and then using that as a restructured bonus and just prorating that out, and that's how the Falcons would get cap space. So again, Falcons, I believe when I calculated this for 2020, the max cap savings that they could have if they do a traditional restructure for Ryan, like I just mentioned, is like 14.5 million. So that's something that I think me and you both agreed on. Then the Falcons should certainly entertain that, at least some level of that, maybe not the full 14 million, but something that they can do over the next couple years until they eventually kind of rip up that contract and give him a new one. And at that point, it would start the process over again. Jake Matthews is another candidate. I thought they should have done it this year with him to, again, shrink his base salary, give him a restructured, signing bonus. Could have saved some money. Could have, it would have allowed them, to get a Gerald McCoy, I thought. And that's why I kept pounding the table on that, is that was an avenue to save cap space before even the Grady deal and the Deion Jones deal. But Jake Matthews, again, would be a candidate next year, and I think the maximum that they can save in 2020 on his is about 7.3 million. So again, those are the traditional restructures we should expect going forward. But the whole voidable thing that the teams like the Eagles and Saints are doing, and Patriots, not necessarily something that's going to come into play right now, in my opinion.
Yeah, the way I sort of see it, it's about 14 and a half, 14, maybe round up to 14.6 million that the Falcons can do
Yep.
max on Ryan's restructure. And I guess my stance is, like, you look at that, and then if they did it again in 2020 and or 2021, and it'll depend on what the new CBA and how they address, like, sort of minimum contracts. So this number may not be 100% accurate, but it's about like 9.8 million, 9.7 million in 2021. So you're looking at about 24 and a half million dollars in terms of max cap space that the Falcons can free up over the next 2 off seasons by doing these sort of traditional restructures of Matt Ryan's deal. And I guess my point that I said to Matt on Twitter was that, like, for me, when you look at this team, and Matt's response was from a tweet from Justice Mosqueda, I think, basically saying, like, smart teams are basically taking these quarterbacks in their prime, and Matt helped me out with sort of the exact wording of the tweet.
It was basically you're taking money now, savings now while they're in their prime, while you have your window, and basically pushing it off and saying, all right, we're going to have to rebuild eventually. We'll just we'll deal with the consequences then during the rebuild, as far as what potentially, dead money, or, again, in the case of Tom Brady with these voidable years, the Patriots will take, their lumps during those years, as long as they're saving money now in the here and now while they're still in their Super Bowl window. Essentially, Justice Mosqueda was saying it's not a bad strategy, and I was basically agreeing with him and saying, yeah, the Falcons might consider doing something like this when, again, Ryan's 38, 39, just to extend that window a couple more years, save cap space in the here and now, and then when they do have to rebuild, then whatever, they're rebuilding anyway, so what's it matter?
Yeah, and I guess where I would add to it, I think the Falcons should be taking that strategy, like, right now. And basically,
Yeah.
because we're sitting here thinking, okay, Matt Ryan's going to play another 4, 5, 6, 7, possibly 8 or 9 years. You're not going to, at any point during that period of time, unless something crazy happens, be like, well, it's time to move on from Matt Ryan. Like, our window is basically the rest of Matt Ryan's career, and so you want to
Yep.
maximize that window. And one way that helps you maximize that window is having money to spend to plug holes and wherever. And we've seen the Philadelphia Eagles do this with Fletcher Cox's contract, that they gave him a monster contract, and they've restructured, I think, at least the last 2-3 years to create cap space, because the Eagles have been one of those teams that go into the offseason above the cap, and then they figure out a way, and it's helping them be a contender year in and year out. And I think the point I was adding to Matt, and I don't think he disagrees with, is that's really the strategy that the Falcons should be doing. And so taking Matt Ryan's contract over these next 2 years, in addition to other players like Jake Matthews, and maybe that's Desmond Trufant, maybe that's Devontae Freeman as well, and trying to create as much cap space so that you can use that money in free agency to plug some holes and go after and maybe get a couple of, at least mid-tier players, a couple more mid-tier players to plug some of these holes and really give yourself a better shot at making a run is the best strategy. And then for me at least, come 2022, when Matt Ryan has 2 years left on his contract, then the Falcons can do some 5 or 6 year extension at, probably at that point in time, $40 million a year or whatever the case may be, and then just keep doing the restructure thing until Matt Ryan retires. And then, as Matt mentioned, when Matt Ryan, at the end of that contract, that extension, it'll be like 2025, 2026, and he'll be around 40 years old. Then they can sort of do this voidable year thing like the Saints, like the Patriots have done, where it's essentially a year-to-year sort of thing, where you do like a 3-year extension and then you have voidable years. And so at any point in time, you can get out of the contract like the Patriots presumably could do with, some of the rumors I've heard with this Tom Brady thing is like he's going to retire after the season, and the voidable years basically gives them a way to spread out money now, but then be able to be like, oh, okay, well, we can just get out of this contract without having to cut Tom Brady or whatever the case may be if he decides to hang it up after the season. So, that's a strategy that the Falcons could potentially employ in terms of that voidable year thing, probably down the road. That's probably not something on the horizon. But in the meantime, I do think the Falcons can really help themselves by trying to restructure these Ryan contracts and create as much cap space. I've long said that the salary cap is a speed bump, and it's one of those things where it's an obstacle. It slows you down. You can't necessarily just go speeding down the street as far as like spending money and all these sort of things. But it's not really like a huge deterrent or whatever the case may be. And I think, at least from my perspective, I think the Falcons have been making it a bigger obstacle than it needs to be, because of sort of Thomas Dimitroff just like doesn't want to kick money down the road, because it does eventually bite you in the butt. But like, I think we speak for all fans in saying like, if it's going to help, creating, $14 million is going to help you go out there and be a better football team, why are you not doing that just because 4 or 5 years from now, when the salary cap is $250 million, you're afraid you might have to pay for it? Like that just, obviously,
Yeah.
they have, their things with their finances and whatnot. But sitting here today, it's like, if you can create $14 million in cap space by restructuring Matt Ryan, why wouldn't you do it? There's really no excuse for you not to do it, especially because you're expecting Matt Ryan to pay another 7 years, and you're going to not have to take
Yeah.
the bullet for that contract until like 8 years from now or something like that. So,
Right. And it all goes back to, these are the prime years. Ryan's playing at an MVP level. Have the money now. It doesn't matter if, when Ryan's age 38, 39, and maybe the time is coming up. If you don't have the money then again, the window is now when Ryan's playing at an all-time high. It's important to surround him with as many assets as you can, and doing these restructures is the way to
yeah, I
do
mean,
it.
the Saints are a perfect example of, they've been in a position to win Super Bowls the last 2 years. Fortunately, they have not, for our sakes. But they have
Yeah.
basically been like, look, we'll deal with this salary cap issue when Drew Brees is done, and when when
Yep.
we have a rookie, then we can, we'll cut salary and do. It's just like, it doesn't make any sense to
Yep.
basically restrict yourself. That's basically the point I'm trying to make.
Yep.
Okay, Dirty Bird number 2 at Matt MVP Ryan asks, fun question. We'll be the judge of that. Matt Ryan says he is determined to win a championship for the city of Atlanta. How many championships, if any, do you predict that Matt Ryan will win as a Falcon before he retires? Just take a shot. I predict he will win He will most likely win a total of one.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of where I'm leaning. That's the safe money. Although I'm sure you'll say the safe money is probably zero. I don't know. Maybe you won't. Maybe you won't, depending on your mood right now. But I've always been a big believer that Matt Ryan will hoist the Lombardi Trophy at some point. So I think one is in the cards, and as we know, it's always the toughest to get that first one, under your belt. And once they do, who knows? I mean, if they keep the core, which they've locked up a lot of the core already now for the next couple of years, if they can get their first here in 2019, then we could be potentially looking at a scenario where they win in 2021, or maybe they go back to back. Who knows? And kind of pull, kind of a Denver Broncos scenario when John Elway was the quarterback, which again, in the back of my head as a fan, that's my hope, is that uh, Matt Ryan emulates that type of career finish type of deal, where he can get a couple in the twilight of his career, like John Elway did. Because John Elway is kind of the outlier as far as, there's that stat out there that, um, you know, quarterback combination. I don't know if it's quarterback and head coach, or if it's just head coach, as far as that 5 year rule, where if you can't win one in your fifth year as a head coach, at least, it's extremely tough moving forward. And again, John Elway is the outlier. Peyton Manning, as far as quarterbacks, again, is another outlier. It took him 9 seasons, I believe. Uh, John Harbaugh, of the Ravens. I'm not sure if it was his fifth or sixth year. He might have got it in the sixth year with the Ravens in 2012. But again, it's extremely tough the longer you get into this. But again, I certainly think Matt Ryan has what it takes. It's just a matter of, again, I think going back to what we were saying earlier, um, are they surrounding him with enough of the pieces? Again, a lot also has to go right. I mean, you can have a great roster on paper, but you don't win a championship on paper. You do need those bounces to go your way. But I do think when it's all said and done, one's likely. But again, if they get one, then they know how to do it with this bunch. A couple more maybe could follow. But yeah, I think one's in the cards, in my opinion. I've long said this.
Now, look, obviously, I want to say at least one, right? I guess if you shot me up with true serum, I'd probably say zero. And I guess the reason why I'm not necessarily overly enthusiastic in terms of my optimism on this specific question is just because I feel like if the Falcons wind up firing their coaching staff after this season, then you're just starting all over. And, I don't necessarily feel that overly optimistic or confident that the next coach is going to be the automatic improvement that I'm sure we will all convince ourselves he is 100% going to be, at least given Arthur Blank's hiring history as far as coaches go. So it's one of those things where, like, for me, it's like I want to kind of like the reason why I'm sort of waffling and copping out on this answer is I kind of want to see how this season goes before I express too much enthusiasm over like the inevitability of the Falcons winning a Super Bowl. If they go like 7-9 this year, and like then I'm like, oh well, it's going to be tough. But if they sort of get everything back on board and go 10-6, like I hope and think they can, then I feel a lot better about saying one is in the cards down the road. I don't necessarily expect this year to be their championship year. I think this year is kind of just a hey, let's just make the playoffs and see if we can get things back on track in 2020 type of year, as opposed to this is going to be our best shot. But we've had a conversation I think it was last week or the week before, about sort of when Dirk Cutter is your head coach or your play caller, your that first year is really your best option, your best shot. So that's part of the reason why I'm not overly enthusiastic about it. So it's a tough question. So I will say let's go with one, because I just think Matt Ryan will probably play enough seasons that the pendulum, even if it doesn't necessarily go in our way this year, will at least swing back, and I'm at least quasi optimistic that things will go okay this year, and we won't be cleaning house after the season. So I'll say one, but I'm sure if you put some truth serum in my arm, and I would just be spouting horrible things about all the Mohamed Sanu and whatever, and being like, yeah, they're not gonna win anything and whatever. But like that's just me in my
Yeah.
darkest, deepest places. So, Vienna Falcons. How glad are you that we dodged the Adam Gase bullet? Speaking of Cutter,
So, I mean, this answer might sound crazy, much like Adam Gase kind of is in his personal life, which we saw today on Twitter. I don't really think because I mean, again, I was one of those that was in favor of Adam Gase as the offensive coordinator. But we're obviously seeing Adam Gase as a head coach, maybe not the most level-headed person to lead a team, but to call plays and to be an innovative offensive mind. That's kind of why I was in support of him as an offensive coordinator. So, again, I would have gladly taken the bullet to see what he could have done with this offense as an offensive coordinator had he not gotten the head coaching job in New York. But I think what we've seen in Miami and now what we're seeing in the very early stages of his Jets tenure. Yeah, I don't think he's cut out or fit to be a leader or head coach of an organization. But um, certainly as a play caller, I would have given that. I would say no. I'm not necessarily glad we dodged the Adam Gase bullet because I still believe right now I would have kind of rather had him as the offense coordinator than Dirk Cutter. But we'll see. Hopefully, Dirk proves me wrong in the second go around.
well, my expectations with Adam Gase, at least in New York, is whatever the Jets do this year is probably going to be their best year. So it'd be kind of similar to what I just said about Dirk Cutter, where like this first year is going to be their best shot, and then he'll probably kind of do what happened in Miami and sort of just teeter off and be back on the market within 2 or 3 years or whatever the case may be. So, um, sitting here today with the value of I don't recall what my take on Adam Gase was at the time. I probably was reasonably favorable to that possibility of hiring as an offensive coordinator. But I don't necessarily feel like we dodged a bullet, nor do I necessarily feel like, oh man, we got the better hire. Again, I still remain skeptical of Dirk Cutter. I think he'll do a good job because I just think the talent and that we have here and the familiarity that he has here means that you kind of got to be really bad at your job to not have a top 10 offense. With this Falcons team, but we'll sort of have to see if he can sort of reach the ceiling that I think this team potentially has offensively. But for me at least, like the one I guess the one person I can recall being intrigued by during that whole coaching cycle was more John D. Filippo than anybody else. But he's now in Jacksonville, and we'll see how he does with Nick Foles and all of them. So, all right, last question. It's a very serious question coming from Falcoholic Matt. Is Julio Jones good?
Yes.
Well, Matt, I think the question of good versus evil is a very complicated question. And, I think for 31 other teams that they would perceive Julio Jones not as good, but as evil. And you know what they say every villain is the hero of his own story. And for 29 other NFL cities, Julio Jones is definitely a villain, given what he does to those defenses. So, only really in one of those cities is Julio Jones the hero. So, I mean, if you think about it from that perspective, yeah, I guess he is not good. He is evil. At least it's how he's perceived around most of this country and most of the world. But you know, at least in the state of Georgia and for the millions of Falcon fans around the world and around the globe, he is good. So, yeah. I mean, it's just a matter of perspective, I think. There you have it, guys.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better myself. I mean,
Very philosophical ending to the show.
yeah, we'll end on that.
We will be back next week on Tuesday. Matt won't be rocking it out at any concerts, not that I'm aware
No.
of. So, we'll be back on Tuesday to recap this Dolphins game as well as get you guys geared up for Adam Gase and the Jets, I believe. So we can have a little bit more Adam Gase conversations next week in lieu of that game coming up. Of course, you know how to hit us up with questions. You can use the hashtag Falcons mailbag and send those to either myself or Matt's Twitter handles. You should see those on the screen below you, at FalcFans and at Matt Karoly, Karoly for all you audio listeners out there. And of course, the show's Twitter handle is Falcons PFC. Check us out at profootballcentral.com, where you can get the links to where you can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast. You can find us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Just search for Pro Football Central or Falcon Central Radio. Of course, check us out on Facebook. Falcon Central Radio is the name of the page. Should give you guys a heads up. We might be doing more Facebook Live stuff in the coming weeks. We're still trying to figure out sort of exactly how we want to do this format. So if you haven't liked our page on Facebook, you definitely want to do that, because we might wind up doing a Facebook Live show next week or the week after. So be sure to check us out. But certainly we're not going to leave you YouTubers high and dry. So definitely subscribe to Pro Football Central on the YouTube. Hit that bell icon so that you know when we go live and when we are updated. So, Matt, any other last thoughts that you want to leave the listeners and viewers with?
I got a couple souvenirs that I'm going to be giving away that I got exclusively at the Hall of Fame. So we're going to do 2 giveaways, I think one this week, one next week, and that'll be run on the Falcons Central Radio Twitter page. So again, at Falcons PFC. So be on the lookout for them, chance to win them, stuff that you could only get if you were there this past weekend. So, yeah.
Okay, there you have it, guys. We'll be back next Tuesday. Enjoy the game tomorrow. Enjoy your weekends, all that stuff.
Eyes up.